We've spent months discussing Brexit deals in video after video, talking about the one that May struck with the EU, the potential other options, including the option of a no deal, and also how much Parliament does, or more accurately doesn't, like any of the options they've been presented with. In recent weeks, more and more talk has been concentrated on the withdrawal agreement, the divorce section of Brexit negotiations, which sets out how we're going to sever the current links. What the recent indicative votes have done is place greater significance on the actual nitty-gritty of the Brexit negotiations, the future relationship. The future relationship isn't exactly nailed down just yet. The current proposal can be found within the non-legally binding political declaration, which May negotiated with the European Union. This political declaration is actually very short and doesn't go into a whole lot of detail just yet. It will be further fleshed out during the next stage in the negotiations. The terms of the future relationship are broadly based on Theresa May's negotiating red lines. These are the lines which she isn't willing to cross when making a deal. What exactly were these red lines, and why were they flawed from the very beginning, at least from the European Union's perspective? Well, over 2 years ago, in a speech at Lancaster House, Prime Minister Theresa May first set out her 12 red lines, ranging from providing certainty and clarity to strengthening the union, controlled immigration, and securing new trade agreements with other countries. Until recently, these red lines underpin the entirety of the Brexit negotiations, forming the basis of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Some of the notable red lines included taking control of our own laws, strengthening the union, protecting our strong and historic ties with Ireland and maintaining the common travel area, controlling immigration, protecting workers' rights, ensuring free trade with European markets, securing new trade agreements with other countries, and cooperating in the fight against crime and terrorism. At the time, people were advocating, and continue to advocate, for a departure based on other countries and their relationships with the EU, most notably Norway, Switzerland, Canada, and Turkey. We don't have time to dive into all of those options right now, but as I mentioned at the top, we actually have videos which go into some of these topics in detail. The problem with most of these options is the set of red lines that May put in place. This is summarised in a slide created for the European Commission by the Task Force for the Preparation and Conduct of the Negotiations with the United Kingdom under Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union. Catchy, right? It was presented by Michel Barnier in December 2017 and succinctly highlights the flaws in May's negotiating strategy. The first option it presents is the UK staying within the EU. Obviously, this crosses the most basic of red lines. The UK must leave the EU. So next up, and one step further away from EU membership, is a Norway-style deal, also known as staying within the European Free Trade Association. If the UK were to seek a Norway-type relationship by entering into the European Free Trade Association, alongside Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, who we'll get onto later, we would formally leave the EU, but a number of red lines would be broken. All 4 current members of the European Free Trade Association participate in the European Single Market and are party to the Schengen Agreement, both requiring the acceptance of free movement. However, a recent Commons briefing paper does note that Liechtenstein has secured an amendment to the European Economic Area Agreement, which has enabled it to continue to apply certain restrictions on free movement of people. The UK could potentially diverge from the EFTA model and could seek stronger amendments to the EEA agreement to further limit freedom of movement. However, the EU has made it clear on several occasions that freedom of movement is a central pillar to the single market, so if free movement is necessary, that breaks a red line. Similarly, membership of the European Free Trade Association prevents regulatory autonomy. Members are required to implement EU laws relating to the single market and do not have a decision-making role in the development of these rules, but are consulted. Member states are also subject to the rulings of the EFTA Court, which, despite not having the same enforcement powers as the Court of Justice of the European Union, with its judgments only being advisory and non-binding, it largely follows the CJEU's judgments. The UK being beholden to these courts breaks another red line. EFTA member states also make financial contributions to the EU in 2 ways. Contributing to broad EU regional policy goals by providing grants to reduce social and economic disparities in the European Economic Area, and contributing to the cost of the EU programmes in which they participate, largely in proportion to their share of GDP. This again breaks another red line, as May doesn't want the UK contributing to the EU post-Brexit. Unlike certain options, members of EFTA are not part of the European Customs Union, meaning they are able to pursue independent trade policies. EFTA and EU membership covers services as well as goods, which could benefit the UK, as services are currently the largest component of the UK's GDP. Despite the potential advantages of this model, it does violate 4 red lines. The UK will remain under ECJ jurisdiction, free movement would be necessary, financial contributions would be very necessary, and the UK wouldn't have complete regulatory autonomy. So as we move further to the right of this chart, we get further away from the EU. So next is the Swiss model. Although also part of EFTA, Switzerland has a somewhat unique relationship with the EU, having a series of bilateral agreements with the EU which enable it to participate in aspects of the single market, obligating it to implement certain rules. The Swiss model in practice is identical to the Norway model, diverging solely on the issue of court jurisdiction. Switzerland is not subject to the judgments of the EFTA courts, removing it from this aspect of CJEU jurisdiction. However, as I mentioned, everything else will stay the same as the Norway model. So remember those 3 other red lines? Well, yeah, they're still all being crossed. So how about we try moving further away from the EU and see if we have any more luck there? One step further will take you to the Ukrainian model. Although a not well-known model, Ukraine has a legal relationship with the EU through a deep and comprehensive free trade area. Again, another catchy name there. This is essentially the first step towards allowing Ukraine to gain full membership of the EU in future. These deep and comprehensive free trade areas, which the EU also has with Georgia and Moldova, grant them access to the European single market in certain sectors, and does not require the acceptance of free movement. However, this selected access to the single market comes with the acceptance of ECJ jurisdiction and a forfeiture of regulatory autonomy. 2 lines, therefore, are still being broken. So one step further away from the EU brings us to the Turkish model. Moving on to Turkey brings us the closest to acceptability under May's red lines. Turkey is in a customs union with the EU, but not the European Customs Union. Turkey has selected access, covering all industrial goods, but not including agricultural ones. Turkey does not have to accept free movement, and does not make substantial contributions to the European Union, and retains regulatory autonomy. However, there are many flaws in attempting to replicate the EU-Turkey model. In terms of red lines, Turkey no longer has an independent trade policy. It remains obligated to enforce a common external tariff for products covered by its customs union. The Commons briefing also makes clear that the customs union foresees that Turkey is to align to the body of EU law in several essential internal markets. That the EU-Turkey border is not frictionless, in part due to the nature of the EU-Turkey customs union, and that there is an asymmetric relationship in the operation of the customs union. Turkey has no seat in EU free trade negotiations, and must open up its market to the countries with which the EU has negotiated a free trade agreement, but does not automatically gain reciprocal access to those markets. Finally, the EU-Turkey customs union does not cover services, which could be another major issue for the UK economy. But beyond that, remember there's still a major red line being broken with this option. Which brings us to the final model, the Canadian model. This is the only option which does not expressly breach a red line. That, however, doesn't mean that it's the perfect model for the UK to replicate. Under the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA for short, certain barriers between the EU and Canada were eliminated without some of the costs. However, according to the Commons briefing, in a Canada-style relationship, the UK would not be required to adopt all single market rules, in the same way as it would as a member of the EEA, and CETA nearly eliminates tariffs on all goods and 94% of agricultural products, and also aims at reducing non-tariff barriers. Canada certainly retains regulatory autonomy, is not subject to freedom of movement, and does not contribute substantially to the EU's budget. However, Canada's access to the single market is not unrestricted. Trade is not frictionless. There's no passporting, whereby a financial service company registered with one country can do business with all EEA member states without further authorization, with mutual recognition of professional qualifications also remaining to be negotiated. And this is a big deal for the UK. Passporting rights are a significant concern to the UK's very large financial services industry. Ultimately, as we've explained, there are barriers and issues with all of the standard models. And although many argue that the UK will be able to tailor and amend existing models to its benefit, as those who push for a Norway Plus model hope, the existing models will form the basis of any negotiations, be it on the UK or EU side. Models that, in the case of CETA, took 5 years to negotiate, a further 2 years to sign, and remains to this day, some 10 years after the beginning of negotiations, only provisionally signed. So it's clear that even without red lines, getting a deal isn't going to be easy. With a load of red lines that prevent almost any deal from taking place, going in expecting a decent deal is almost ridiculous, and is honestly the reason why the only option we really have left is a no deal. To be updated on Brexit as time goes on, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Also, while you're at it, follow us across some of our other social platforms, so we can keep you up to date when we post exclusive content and articles. You can find us by searching for TLDR News.